Welcome to Secure Insights, the podcast where you can hear about the latest cybersecurity issues, quick hacks, and trending IAM products directly from the industry's top data security experts. Our host for today is Kirk Sullivan, CEO of TrueNews.Global. He is a successful visionary technology executive with a proven track record of accelerating business velocity through planning, innovation, transformation, and the strategic use of technology. Today, we are discussing identity and access management for startups and how to architect scalable and secure IAM infrastructure using the power of open source technologies. Hi Kirk, hope you're doing good. So today we are here to talk about TrueNews.Global and your startup. So can you tell us a little bit about your startup TrueNews and the problem you're trying to solve?
Sure. Yeah, TrueNews.Global is a platform really to design a different way, redefine really how we produce, consume, and interact with news and fight fake news and disinformation. This is a big problem across the world that we want to address and help. It's the first product we're building on top of a identity protection component that we've built.
Sounds interesting. So how important is cybersecurity and particularly identity and access management when building products from scratch? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Cybersecurity and identity access management, those two things are absolutely critical to anyone doing a project, whether it's a startup or whether it's an existing company. Not only is it important to TrueNews.Global, but also to the underlying identity provider that we call MIA Security. For True News, people will be able to, for the first time, take action on the news and associated polling. And you need to have anonymity, if you want it, to freely express your opinion without fear of retribution. News consumers can choose whether to use their real name or an alias when they comment on a news item, when they vote, when they corroborate evidence or reward the writers of news stories, facts, and evidence. So this identity access management part is a central component and very important.
And how important has it become, right, to solve for online identity in the current market? Because we've seen fake news and misinformation being on the rise. So can you tell us a little bit about how online identity is getting important?
Yeah, in terms of news, we see the online identity problem all the time. Twitter recently attempted to validate people with their plan that they're planning on bringing out. Social media's problem with foreign countries influencing our elections, and just to every company where people can represent themselves as someone else. This project originally started years ago to address how people can avoid that surveillance wheel that everyone's on. And companies can have verified people as customers and suspects and prospects and all the things that support their business. So solving for this online identity has been job one for this project. It just happened to be that True News as a set of functionality sits on top of that identity piece perfectly.
And how should one approach security, right, when considering identity and access management? Because you've had experience dealing with this problem in certain. So what would be your approach to that?
Yeah, as usual, we have to look at the requirements, right? I've worked across many industries and worked with many companies. So it's not just about startups. It's not just about small businesses. It's about large as well. Everybody has these problems. What's your user base look like? Employees, contractors, marketing, suspects, prospects, customers, business-to-business users, machine-to-machine interfaces. All those things are elements of your business that you need to understand first. Once you understand the landscape of what you need, then look at what level of identity verification you need about those users. So maybe it's a high value transaction where you really have to make sure that you've got that person, but maybe there's some other transactions that don't really matter as much to that level of verification needed. And that usually brings hassling the user a bit in terms of verifying their identity, though we're making that easier with the current standards that are out there. Then there's the moral side of it, the moral compass question. Will you use third parties to provide enhancement data about your customers, about your employees? How does this align with the integrity of your business and your employees in supporting the companies that are surveilling people? Do you want to consider that? I think you should. Is there an alternative? And that's part of our project too, as a matter of fact, to provide that alternative as we progress. Then, what level of identity assurance do you need? Like we talked about, right? Maybe you need to use a professional firm to do real background checks for highly classified work. Maybe you need different levels of authentication for different types of transactions. Once you have a handle on these requirements, your audience, your level of assurance needed, etc., then you can decide what type of solution will work for your needs. Perhaps you can use an off-the-shelf cloud offering. There's a bunch of them that are good, but you should be aware of the risks. We've seen many examples of how the data about your users and your employees, your customers, can be seen by more people than you think, as our Twitter example earlier kind of showed, right? And other articles that are out there today, stories about that. There's a risk to your business at two levels that everyone needs to be aware of. Business folks are a brand risk of being hacked and what that does to your brand, and a financial risk. And more of that coming, not less, in terms of the laws that are being passed in the EU and California and other countries that are clamping down on, the impact of being hacked and having personal information be stolen. So you have to balance all these factors out that we've discussed to figure out what makes sense for you.
Yep. Yeah, looks like a lot of factors you have to try to balance initially. Take a look at your brand, look at your business objectives and your goals. But what have been your learnings, right, from working in this industry? And if you could share a few stories with us about those.
Yeah, sure. The data that you think is secure, both inside and outside your company, isn't. I've worked across 16 industries in my career doing technology and business consulting. And as recent news stories have pointed out that we talked about, the data that you trust to vendors likely isn't as secure as you think, and even the data inside your company. And there's a couple of examples we can talk about, right? Although I won't mention specific companies, but almost everywhere these things apply. They all sound like that recent story about Twitter from their former security chief. Way too many people have access to personal info. And not only in the online production system, right, the thing that's live with your customers and with your employees, but I've known many companies that take their data from the production environment and copy it into test environments without doing any obfuscation, changing the data so that it's not identifiable to any person. It's just laziness. It's just lack of governance. It's lack of controls, which is always the rough edge of speed, right? It always gets in the way of speed. Data is copied all over the place in companies in clear and readable forms. If I was a bad guy, right, I could have easily made a mint selling info like that on the dark web, because depending on the company, it could include what the industry calls PII, personally identifiable info, like your social security number, country ID number, address, phone, driver's license, all that kind of stuff. There's a ton of identity theft out there. We know this, but given the hacking out there, I'm afraid that there's a huge wave coming. Using this info to affect people's financial and physical security. If you had a black hat that you could put on and understand what you can do with that kind of data, you should be scared. That's bad news.
Yep, I think there is a lot of responsibility here to be taken, right, within the community in cybersecurity to at least try and empower and make sure that data is not leaked online or PIIs are not exposed by these organizations. But wanting to switch back towards our other topic, right? How did you come to know about Sennovate? And because we are working together on solving this issue of fake identities and solving for identities online, what has your experience been so far working with Sennovate and the team here?
Yeah, I heard of Sennovate through the folks at Glue. Mike Schwartz, the founder and CEO of Glue, had advised me to contact Sennovate as a party that could support a startup like mine working from a limited budget. I'd worked with another firm prior with mixed results. The work from the folks at Sennovate, from leadership to sales to technical work, has been outstanding. I'm very impressed, and I'm very difficult to impress given my background and how many companies I've worked with, both as suppliers as well as customers. And I'm a tough judge for sure, given my background. So it's very important to find that right partner that you can trust and that will do the work with the kind of integrity that you need, especially in the security realm.
Yep, got it. I think Sennovate has been working towards the identity space, and working with you has also helped us learn more and try achieving things that we have try to build ourselves and probably with some partner, right? So we also talked about Glue being one of the solutions and the CEO recommending you to us. Can you also tell us about open source solutions in this realm, and what role do open source solutions play for IAM?
Yeah, open source does play a very important role, not only for making products accessible at no cost to startups like myself, but also to be able to build on that community that works on this software. From reviewing code, right? If it's open source, it's available for review. So you can have lots of folks looking at that code and reviewing it, to contributing to that code and building it better. These are things that are important today in the way that we build software. Open source can be more secure because of that community. As a startup, it's helpful to have very good software free. And as an architecture person, I try to always pick the right pieces of software up front, factoring in whether it makes sense to go open source or not. We'll talk about that a bit more. The challenge can be that open source software is often not as well documented, can be a bit buggy sometimes, and can take a deeper talent pool. You got to have people that have some chops in your company to deal with it. There can be legal challenges as well for some companies in embracing open source as well. Those are surmountable, but you have to be aware of them. I find open source to be an important thing to embrace when it makes sense, right? Especially when you can find a good partner to help you with the technical challenges of that software, like I have with Sennovate with the Glue product.
Understood. So open source sounds interesting and can also probably solve problems in a different use case, and probably use case you are trying to solve or an organization. But how can one leverage open source solutions, right, to solve particularly IAM problems for that matter?
Yeah, in the IAM realm, right? Yeah, I'm with you. So, well, we have to go back to the requirements we talked about earlier. Really, the requirements that you have may lead you to an open source solution making sense. For example, for me, extreme paranoia about the security of my users' data, the flexibility of the solution to introduce new authentication methods, and the scalability were factors that drove me to this Glue open source security product. Your requirements may be different, but for me, that's kind of where I ended up. As I mentioned, there are cloud-based things, which you can use cloud-based solutions. There are more complex enterprise-level solutions that you can buy commercially, but something like a Glue is the best of both worlds from my requirements perspective.
Got it. So you've certainly explored the whole IAM realm and also the open source solutions that solve for this. So what are your recommendations, right, when it comes to opting for open source solutions?
Well, I'd say consider open source if it provides the functionality that you need, first of all, right? Today and tomorrow, use your crystal ball as an architecture person, right, to figure that out. Fits your legal license requirements, because there are requirements depending on the licensing of open source software that you have to comply with, which makes sense. Provides adequate security, right? That's the bottom line with this. And then if you're going to pick open source, right, that active community that keeps it vibrant. How active is it? Where's the industry going? Use your analyst firms, use your peer network connections to kind of figure out what makes sense. And of course, finally, it fits into your financial need in terms of purchasing the commercial support that you probably want to get, you know, when you go into production with one of these open source type products, to have the right level of support from the experts, right? The folks who promote that project.
Yep. So you touched upon using the crystal ball to make sure whatever you're trying to architect makes sense in the longer term as well. So what are your do's and don'ts, right, to recommend people when architecting with IAM solutions and for solving IAM issues?
Do's and don'ts. So do your diligence to understand what the data held by the IAM product is. How is it secured? We talked about data earlier being copied around. Well, it's not just the data being copied around, it's where is the data? How many places does this important information sit in my enterprise? That's important to understand that. So know what data the IAM product is going to hold on to. How is it secured? You know, whether there's ways to mitigate those risks. For example, how many places should the PII of your customers be located? Should it be in only one system if possible? In the security system, in the customer database? How many other places does it really make sense? Do you need it all in all those places? Depending on the solution, depending on the cloud solution, commercial solution, or open source solution, you can mitigate these risks, right? As we're doing in our project. minimizing the data that's held redundantly across multiple systems.
Got it. So coming back to the IAM part, right? So talk of the town is data breaches. We hear about data breaches around the corner throughout the year. So what are your lessons, right, from and your thoughts on the recent data breaches, and also about Mudge, the issue that has been plaguing over in the news? So what are your thoughts on that?
So the fact that this guy Mudge from Twitter, a security head guy and ex-hacker, spoke up about the fact that wide accessibility was there. Everybody could get to all the sensitive data was very brave of him to do. And it was absolutely the right thing to do from an integrity perspective. It's not new. As I mentioned, almost every company I've worked with, and there's been a lot, has issues in terms of keeping their sensitive data safe. From administrators with too much access, to end users having access, to lacking the controls to review and update access, to copying the data around like we spoke earlier, and the redundancy storage of data in different places. Those are all things you have to look at.
Got it. And so startups, when they're trying to scale and build solutions, they try to build fast and make sure they miss corners here and there. So what are your lessons, right? You're also trying to build something of your own in the IAM space and online identity. So what are your lessons, right, for startups to avoid data breaches in general and also make sure things are done the way they're supposed to?
That's a great question, because you're absolutely right. The first thing we do in startups is produce some MVP that's all about showing some functionality and doesn't think about the back end. Plan first, right? Often we're running so fast, we make a mess of things that has to be redone. Architect your security strategy up front and don't let it be compromised. That's really, really important, right? Otherwise, once the barn doors open, it's hard to get it closed, right? Because the horses have left. Often we have to make hard choices and add to our list of technical debt, as we call it. But this should not happen for sensitive data, for stuff that you care about. I call sensitive data everything about the customer too, not necessarily just the things that the industry calls PII, but everything. On top of that, understand your requirements now and in the future when picking those security products, like we talked about earlier, and architecting how your systems use this data. An architect's job is to use their crystal ball to help further mitigate this risk. That's the best advice I can give you.
Got it. That sounds great advice. But with startups, right, there is always a priority. Where do you prioritize on people, process? You also have other things going on. So how do you balance between, right, people, process, and technology when building for an MVP product?
It's difficult balancing people, process, and technology, and not just for startups, but for everybody. There's no easy answer out there to that. Organization structure is important. You may have heard that the structure of your organization often influences your process. For example, in many larger companies, you have different departments in charge of different pieces of the infrastructure, say a middleware team that are the only ones who can deploy things to the platform. And then the process of deploying becomes more complex. It involves more people, leaders with different agendas and measures, et cetera, all get involved in this. I'm a believer, and this applies to startups as well, to make people personally responsible for their area and enable them with the tools and the authority, right, organizationally and technically, to drive that area. So if you're in charge of a particular API or something like that, you're in charge of everything from coding to deployment. With appropriate automation outside of their control, say replacing certificates or other sensitive stuff that they shouldn't have access to, that's fine. If you do that, that's very similar to the way that the technology is going too. The cradle to grave, they call it now, right? From the beginning of the code through all the DevOps pieces, all the development and operations pieces to build and deploy that thing into production, all that kind of integrated together. Mirror that in your organization.
Got it. Yeah, sounds like great advice. And also, we've talked about startups now. We've also touched upon the breaches part of things, right? As a startup, we are working with us and building this MVP solution for TrueNews.global. So how has your experience been, right, when it comes to architecting these complex IAM solutions with Sennovate? And if you can share your experience for the audience here.
Sure. It's been a good experience. I mentioned that I'd worked with other vendors in this security space in the past, and even dealing with Glue specifically, and Sennovate has stepped up admirably. And I'm not saying that because they're giving me a break to talk in this podcast. It's not related to that. I believe that partnership is key for startups. You got to have the right folks in your corner, and really for all companies, that's true, not just for startups. Building that win-win solution should be the goal of everybody, right? And we should try to build that every time we can. That's what I've enjoyed about the relationship with Sennovate, not only the technical excellence, but the relationship that I know I can count on them to help.
Great. Sounds very good here from our end as well. But yeah, thank you for that. Any closing thoughts, right, before we end? We've talked about IAM, we've talked about startups, breaches all over the place, but any closing thoughts that you have for our listeners and audience?
I guess I'd say the security realm is complex. There's a lot to it, especially in more established companies that have lots of different solutions in place, legacy solutions in place, multiple partners with different kinds of security connections. It's not a simple space whatsoever. Leaders of companies need to wake up, the business leaders and the folks who set the budgets. Given the laws being passed around the world to better protect people's data, you got to address that. Things like data residency requirements levied by countries. Hey, you have to store my people's data, my citizens' data in my country, and you can't take it out even to process it. There are requirements in different countries all over the place now. That's a security aspect, right? So things like data residency, foreign influence and hacking, increases in that going on. It's not gonna go away. And finally, what I mentioned before, the brand and financial liability, that should be enough to wake up our business leaders to deal with this critical area, fund it correctly. You may not understand the details of it. Trust your technical experts to deal with it. But that's the best advice, I guess, from a closing thoughts perspective, is that's what you need to address.
Yep, that's great advice, Kirk. And I think our listeners have taken away a lot of notes and also a lot of learnings from this podcast. Hoping to see True News in the near future and excelling with our MVP and our collaboration together. But yeah, thank you, Kirk, for being here. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And we'll see you in the next episode of Secure Insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This episode of Secure Insights is brought to you by Sennovate, where we empower security innovation for organizations. Catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and all other major platforms with interesting conversations and insights from top data security experts.